from the Lord. It's right there in the Word for your mind, your body, and your soul. It's right there in the Word. The Word of God will set you free. It's right there in the Word. Eternalizing is the key. It's right there in the Word. It's right there in the Word. It's right there in the Word. It's right there in the Word.
Afternoon, Word family, and welcome to another installment of There's a Word for That. The weekly word presentation is part of the Hymns with Phil Carter Fellowship. I'm Pastor Cynthia Turner-Wood, and I'm so delighted that you once again decided to join us. Today's word is set up for worship. Set up for worship. It is in our nature to worship. Everybody worships. Augustine said there's a God-sized hole inside of each of us, and we will not find our rest until we rest in thee. Well, he was talking about God, but not everybody worships God, but I do believe that everybody worships. We all are trying to find something to fill that God-sized hole with, and not all of us fill it with the worship of God, but everybody does worship. Even the atheist worships. Even the agnostic worships. They may not worship God, but they worship the notion of not worshiping God. The pessimist worships the idea of being right about every bad thing that can happen in the world. Everybody worships something or somebody. In Daniel 3, we find the story told of King Nebuchadnezzar. He was the chief leader in Babylon during the time of Daniel and those three Hebrew boys. You remember those three Hebrew boys, don't you? Those boys who were taken captive in the land along with Daniel. Through the course of events, the king came to know these four in a very special way, and he honored the fact that they served the God who was the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. He celebrated that fact, and even though the king didn't worship their God, Yahweh, he worshiped his own God. He was a worshiper. He didn't worship the true and living God, but he did worship his own God. So one day that Daniel does what Daniel does, and he interprets the king's dream. After all, he was an interpreter of dreams. The king gets so excited about what Daniel says, and he orders that there be a creation of an enormous golden statue that stood on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then he ordered everybody to come to the dedication. Everybody had to be at the dedication of this new statue that he was erecting. And everybody, including the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all of the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So everybody did as the king commanded. Everybody went to the statue. They were instructed. They did what they were told to do. And when they heard the music, they did what they were told to do. They bowed down to the statue and they worshiped the statue that the king had set up. And whoever did not worship it would be thrown into a fiery furnace. Well, you know where the rest of this is going. The king set up a statue that everybody needed to worship, and everybody had to bow down and worship the statue. And anybody who didn't bow down and worship it was going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And so it goes. In verse 7, it says, therefore, when all the people heard the music, guess what? They all bowed down and they all worshiped the statue that the king had set up. That is, everybody worshiped the statue. Everybody, the governors, the satraps, everybody worshiped the statue, except, you got it, you know the rest of the story, except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those three Hebrew boys, because they didn't worship statues. They worshiped the true and living God. Somehow they understood something that others did not, that any God that you have to set up is too feeble to be the true and living God. Read the text. The king had set this God up. It says it literally. He had to set this God up. Verse 2, it says the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar set up. Verse 3 says it twice. Verse 5, verse 7, verse 12, verse 14 says the statue I have set up. Verse 15, the statue that I made. Wanted everybody to bow down and worship this thing as God, and yet he was the one who had to set it up. The king's God had to be set up. And all I'm trying to say to you today is this: be careful of serving the gods that other people set up in your life. Oh, you ought to tweet that, you ought to text it, you ought to type it in the chat. Be careful of serving the gods that other people set up in your life, because other people will have demands of you to worship things that you have no business worshiping, including them. You got to be careful, because anything they have to set up is not worthy to be God. Because if they have the ability to set it up, then it's too feeble to be God. And because any God of our own making is not a God worth having. That's why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego rejected the king's God confidently, without even any concern. They knew a setup when they saw one. So they responded in verse 17, listen, if our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, then let him deliver us. Because we're going to depend, rely, hold on to our God. That's what they were saying. We got a God already, and we don't need your God. And if he is able to deliver us from the furnace, then let him do it. But here's the part they go on to say, but if not, be it known to you, O king, that we still will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Whew, what a statement right there. What a dependence on God. What a certitude and a definitive statement that they are making, that their God is the true and living God. Regardless of how God performs in their life, they still know that God is God. There's a message in that for all of us, that they responded by trusting in the character of God and what they knew about God. And they knew that nobody had to set up their God. Their true and living God did not have to be set up. Their God had the ability to wake God's own self up, to clothe God's own self, and to get God's own self together. Their God had been tried and tested and found not lacking. This God, who already brought them through all that they had been through, everything that they had ever gone through, this God was enough to bring them through what they were going through right now, and they were not about to give up on him. There's another word for somebody this morning, that you too can trust the true and living God, that you can trust the track record of your God, who has never had to be set up by anybody. He's already up. He never slumbers nor sleep. He's faithful, and he does this. He's the one that does the setting up. David said, I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord, who made the heaven and earth, not from some golden statue that the king made. David said, he shall set me up. My God sets me up upon a rock, and now shall my head be lifted up above my enemies round about me, and I will sing praises. Yea, will I sing praises to the God of my salvation. Our God does the setting up. He prepares the table before us in the presence of our enemies. He sets things up. He sets me up. I don't need a God that I have to set up, that I have to wake up, that I have to polish, that I have to get ready. I need a God who is faithful, and in due season and at the appointed time, will be the one who will set me up. I hope you need that same God too, because only the true and living God can set the moon overhead and set the stars in their coursets above, because he's faithful. Only God can set the sun to shine close enough to us to warm us, but not so close as to consume us. Only God can set our hearts right and straighten up our crooked minds. Only God, the true and living God, is the one who does the setting up. He's set somebody up today to know that despite what the enemy might be doing in your life, it's only a setup. As the old preacher said, it may just be a setup that is a setback, that is a setup for a comeback in your life. You don't need a God that has to be set up. You need a God who can set you up. up and turn things around and place your feet on solid ground. And the only one who can do that is the true and living God. Well, notice also they understood that any God that you can put dimensions around is a God who is too small to be God. I like that part right there because verse 1 says the king made the statue out of gold, and then they give you all of the dimensions of the statue. They want you to know how magnificent this statue is. Oh, this statue was 60 cubits and its width was 6 cubits. I mean, it was a big statue to be marveled at. And the king set him on the plain of Dura. Well, my brothers and sisters, any God that you can measure, that you can put a dimension on, I don't care how big it is, it's a God that is too small to be your God. You may have a bank account filled with more money and more zeros than Bezos, Branson, Buffett, Musk, and Winfrey all together, and all of the other richest folks in the world, but that's still too small to be your God. You may have the wealth of gold and houses and land, but it's still too small to be your God. If you can put a number on it, a size on it, a tangible substance on it, then it's too small to be your God. For our God can do exceedingly abundantly above all that we can ask or imagine. And if he can do all of that above all that we can ask or imagine, then surely he is above all that we can ask, think, or imagine. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego told the king, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. We don't have to explain to you why we're not bowing at your God. We don't have to explain to you why we are not following your way. I don't think they could explain it if they tried. All they could say was that the God they served was bigger than the problems they were encountering, and his substance could not be consumed by any fire that the king had set. So they simply said, however you wish to destroy us, know this, we will be dying trying. We will be dying trying. I like that. They were willing to die for what they believed, but they were not so weak and bowed down and that they would be crying out to some cold and lifeless piece of gold. If they were going to die, they would be dying while they were still trying to worship the God that they served. Dying trying. We're going to be dying trying. They knew that any God you can who you cannot trust to get you out of the fiery furnace, situations of your life is not fit to be called God anyhow. As in other words, if this situation is too big for our God, then we have labeled our God wrong. I need you to hear that this morning, that whatever the situation is, your God, who is the true and living God, is big enough and great enough and awesome enough to be able to get you out of that situation. Don't you turn to worshiping other stuff and other people and other things when you have a God who is greater than all of that already. Well, you know how the story ends. These three boys would not bow down. Nope, they would not do it. The king got mad about it and upset and perturbed and turned all hot and red. And he said, listen, heat that furnace 7 times hotter than it normally is and throw them boys in, because I need everybody to worship what I worship. Heat the furnace. Make it hotter than it's ever been before. 7 times hotter. Throw those boys in the furnace and let everybody see what happens to people who don't worship the God that I worship. Do all of that I told you to do, and then come back and report to me. Well, that's what the men did. The servants of the king did that. They went and they heated that furnace. They heated it so hot that 3 of the men who were assigned to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace got consumed on the outside of the furnace before they ever got to throw them in the furnace, because that's how hot the furnace was. So hot that those who were assigned to throw the boys in got consumed in the first place. They died in the severity of the heat outside of the furnace without ever even going into the furnace. And that's how hot it was. But let that be a blessing lesson, madame. Let that be a blessing lesson, sir, that those who are in the proximity of your problems can be consumed by what they see on the outside of the problem. But because they don't know your God, they can't handle the heat that is coming from the problem. All they see is what's going on the outside. But I need you to know that Shadrach, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had something within, something going on the inside that insulated them from the heat that was going on the outside. You ought to shout right there. Anybody know about something within that holdeth the rain, something within that manages pain, something within I cannot explain. All that I know is that there's something within. While everybody else is running around being crazy about all the problems that all around, everybody else is losing their head, everybody else is worrying and biting their nails and don't know what to do. I got something within that lets me know that my God is able to handle whatever it is that's going on. And because God is able to handle it, I don't have to lose my mind. So when they threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, they were not consumed. You know the story. They got in there, thrown in, bound by the strongest men, because that's what the king said. Don't just throw them in there, bind them up so they can't get out. Throw them in there bound. And they were bound by the strongest men that the king had. They were thrown in with their tunics, with their trousers, with their hats, with their garments, everything still dressed. They were thrown into a blazing fire that was set 7 times hotter than any fire had ever been set in that thing. And when they were thrown in, the text notes that they fell down. They fell down. Somebody ought to say, oh, shucks, something about worshiping people when they fall down. There's something about a worshiper who falls down. They fell down. And here's the thing. They would not fall down for the king's God. They would not bow down for the king's God. They would not go down for the king's God. So I just have to believe that when they fell down into the fiery furnace, they fell down because it was the true and living God who met them there. They fell down because they knew who to cry out to. They fell down because their God was a God who was worth worshiping and worth bowing down. He was worth to be worshiped. It says that they fell down bound, still tied up with the strength from those strongest men that the king knew, still bound with the anger of their enemies wrapped around them, still yoked with their enemies' wrath. Somebody knows what it feels like to be so bound that the enemy, by the enemy, that you can't get loose. But keep on reading the story. That's not the end of the story. I told you, I believe when they fell down in worship. Whether they were bowing down in worship or whether they fell down, they figured since we down here, we might as well worship our God, the true and living God. We're far away from that golden monstrosity that the king built, that we won't even be confused for worshiping our God. And so they got in there and they fell down, and I believe they fell down in worship, not to the king or to the king's God, but look at verse 24. It says, when the king looked in the furnace, he did not see just 3 men. He saw 4 men. All of them were unbound and walking around in the middle of the fire as if it was a cool spring day. They were walking around unbound, walking in the middle of the fire. They were no longer bound. They were no longer shackled. They were no longer burdened down by their enemy's stuff. They were walking around. 4 of them, 3 got thrown in, but 4 were walking around unbound in the fire, and they were not hurt. And the 4th one, they said, read on, says, had the appearance of a god. I believe they fell down not because they tripped, not because they were shackled, not because they were thrown in and tripped over anything. Oh, but because when they looked inside of the furnace that they were going into, they realized that already on the inside of the furnace was their God that they had been raving about, the God who had seen them through so much, the God who had brought them so much, the one who promised them a way of escape, the one who said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you, the one who said, come what may, we are in this thing together. So when they were in the midst of the fire, they were not consumed, going through the fire untouched, unharmed, and unbound by the cords of the strongest men in the camp. What others meant for evil, God turned around and meant it for good. Their best shot, their hottest furnace, their strongest yoke could not hold back the faith of those whose hearts were fully committed to God. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know what your fiery furnace is. I don't know how hot it is for you right now. I don't even know who has you bound, so bound that you feel like you can't move, can't go forward, can't go backwards. But I do know that while you are feeling down, you might as well worship God. I do too know that the only God can keep you from getting burned. And while you are in the midst of the fire, only God can keep your clothes from being singed. While you are in the midst of going through, only God can keep you from being consumed. Only God can loose you and set you free while you are in the midst of this. That's why that benediction says, now unto him who is able to keep us from falling and to present us faultless before his throne, glorious throne with exceeding great joy. Only to the only wise God, to him be all glory, dominion, majesty, and power, now, henceforth, and forevermore. Now notice this before I let you go. Notice that God did not keep them from the fire. See, you can't spend all the time worrying about why you got in the fire. Why is the fire happening to me? The fire, oh, the fire, oh, the fire. No. God did not keep them from the fire. That's important because somebody is feeling like God forgot you or God slipped up and let you go through some difficult times. Don't get that mixed up. Difficult times are going to come with God or without God. They will come both in both instances. That's true whether you have faith or whether you don't. But what I can say is that difficult times are always better with God than without God. The difficult times are better to get through, better going through with God than without God. Difficult times, you can find hope when you have God. The astonished king called for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out of the fire. Since they were not consumed, since they were not singed and burned up into a crumpled heap, the king said, well, come out of the fire then. And when they did, they were unharmed. The text says so that the fire did not have any power over the bodies of those men. The hair on their heads was not singed. You know how easy it is to burn hair. No. Not in this case. Not with their God. Their hair was not even singed. Only God can take you through the fire and not have the fire touch you. And then you have to come out of the fire not looking like what you've been through. Turn to your neighbor and say, I'm so glad I don't look like what I have been through. Well, so much for their worst attempts, but here's the part that I love the most. When they went in because they were the only ones who would not dishonor their God by bowing down to a feeble, man-made, one-dimensional gold god. But when they came out, everybody from the king on down was bowing down to their God, the true and living God, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has delivered them from the fire. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And everyone ended up worshiping their God. Well, I don't know about you, but I so want to live my life that others will want to worship the God that I serve based on what they see of God's activity in my life. And I pray that is your desire and your will, and that you see that manifested in your life today, tomorrow, and in the future. Let our children worship the God we worship because they see God's activity in our lives. Let our friends come and worship the God we worship because they see God's activity in our lives. Let our enemies come and worship the God we worship because they see God's activity in our lives. It was a setup for worship. Well, I'm so glad that you tuned in on today. I hope you are too. Again, I am Pastor Cynthia Turner Wood, and I'll see you next week for another installment of There's a Word for That. Until next time, know that whatever the issue is, there is a word for that. For the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God shall stand forever. May the Lord God bless you real good.